Yep.
And also thank you for the promotion. I'm actually the executive officer for the LA Mayor's Office of Sustainability. And in that role, I help oversee LA Sustainability Plan, which is called LA's Green New Deal. So today I'm going to get into a little bit more about LA's Green New Deal, what LA is our both our vision as well as how we're executing on it. As many of you might already know, we are the second largest city in the United States. And, we've really pushed ourselves with Mayor Garcetti's leadership to be a leader on the global stage when it comes to climate action. So, like I said, I'm going to talk a little bit about LA's Green New Deal, what that vision is, how we're actually implementing it, and also touch on some of the really exciting opportunities that have come down from the federal government through the Inflation Reduction Act, and how we're hoping to see that turbocharging some of our 445 initiatives. Next
Can you
slide.
see that now, Victoria? Do I have that up?
Perfect. Thank you. The next slide. So half of the population in the world live in cities. It's really why we're the center of commerce, innovation, culture, and travel. But it's also the reason that we're particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So we see in our own city of Los Angeles, worsening heat waves, even this week, historic droughts, as well as record-breaking wildfires. So we need to not only build resiliency to address these risks, but also work to prevent them from getting worse. Next slide. So, some of the benefits of taking these actions are significant. When you look at the savings and healthcare costs because of greenhouse gases, as well as reducing air pollution, the health impacts are significant. So the World Resource Institute said that if we took bold climate action, we could conservatively create direct economic gains of $2 trillion and prevent 700,000 premature deaths globally. 65 million new low carbon jobs could be created by 2030 by taking ambitious actions. This would more than offset any of the jobs lost due to the transition. So all of this really demands that there's immediate and aggressive action. So with that in mind, Mayor Garcetti set about making Los Angeles a model in the planning and implementation of climate action work through LA's Green New Deal. So in 2015, Los Angeles released our very first sustainable city plan. It was accompanied by Executive Directive 7, which really institutionalized sustainability within city government. We established chief sustainability officers within 18 key departments. Mayor Garcetti also made a commitment that not only would the city report annually on its progress towards achieving the goals laid out in the plan, but every 4 years we'd reevaluate those goals. Despite the worsening impacts of climate change, though, just a few short years later, the Trump administration announced the withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement. So in response, Mayor Garcetti began working with mayors from around the country through climate mayors, as well as C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group, to demonstrate that cities are still committed to meaningfully address climate change. And at the same time, we began to closely work with our local stakeholders and community leaders to develop a much more expansive and ambitious roadmap. So in 2019, after a year of stakeholder engagement and quantitative analysis, LA's Green New Deal was released. The next slide. So what is LA's Green New Deal? As I mentioned, it accelerates our 2015 targets, and it set new aggressive goals and a much more expanded agenda that clearly lays out our path to carbon neutrality. We're now one of the first cities that created a plan that was compatible with the Paris Climate Agreement, meaning that LA is working to achieve carbon neutrality by or before 2050. We're proud to say that we are on track to achieving that goal. Environmental justice and equity are really a cornerstone of our work. So we are prioritizing communities that have historically borne the brunt of environmental degradation and are the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And finally, LA is really conscious of our role as a major global city, and that we have the opportunity to really demonstrate the art of the possible when it comes to climate action. Next one. So as you can see from the slide, it really shows the breadth of what is included in the Green New Deal. It's much more than just a plan that sits on a shelf that's, talks about our ambitions and what we'd like to do. It's actually a roadmap that sets out 445 initiatives where we assign responsibility and due dates to departments throughout the city. So we are really touching on more than just carbon reductions, but also tackling things like environmental inequality, affordable housing and homelessness, food deserts, and biodiversity. So this is all part of our plan to really holistically build a more sustainable city. But, reducing greenhouse gas emissions is a primary pillar of the work that we're doing. So I'm just going to get into a bit what we like to call the 5 zeros. Next slide. So in our inventory on greenhouse gas emissions, it became clear that there were 5 key sectors that needed to not just change, but fundamentally transform if we were going to achieve our goal of carbon neutrality. So the 5 zeros, as we like to call them, focus on our energy grid, our building stock, our transportation system, waste, as well as water supply. Next slide. So if we're successful in our efforts, the potential benefits are tremendous, from preventing 1,650 premature deaths to saving $16 billion to creating hundreds of thousands of jobs. There really isn't a moment to lose in this fight. So let me tell you what we've accomplished thus far. Next slide. So transitioning LA's energy grid away from fossil fuels and towards a carbon-free energy is absolutely foundational to LA's carbon neutral future. When LA's Green New Deal was released in 2019, we had set a goal of achieving 100% carbon-free grid by 2045. Now, a lot of people said that this wasn't even possible for a city of our size and complexity, but working with the U.S. Department of Energy and DOE's National Renewable Energy Lab, NREL, we undertook a groundbreaking study. It's called LA 100, and through hundreds of millions of simulations, we determined with them that not only was it achievable, but we could create a reliable and affordable grid, and we could do it by 2035. That's 10 years faster than our original goal. So LA's grid is now powered by 62% clean energy, and we're actually the #1 solar city in America. Through this partnership with NREL, we are really charting a course towards our 100% goal and serving as a model for similar studies across the country, and hopefully similar ambitions as well as application of it. The next slide.
Hey, Victoria, one other thing, I just want to comment on what a great picture. And I think it goes to some of the great strategies that the city is doing, but also some of the challenges. You see, you've got 3 windmills there, generating wind power. There's probably, 100 photovoltaic panels there. They're in the middle of desert. Fortunately, that's clearly outside of LA, not right in downtown LA. But I know there's lots of land as you get out further inland to the east. But it just shows the complexity and both the great strategy to actually implement that. How do you efficiently convert that energy? How do you go about storing that energy? How do you go about transporting that energy within the grid? How much of it is self-contained? How do you make sure there, God forbid, isn't a fire risk? Those are all the things that Corbin from one source is going to discuss when you're trying to deploy that for your facility, for your operation. I just want to point out this is a great example. I feel good about our Angel Beat approach because it illustrates the strategy and the vision that Victoria, Mayor Garcetti, and others have implemented to actually get things like this done. But once you, in a sense, peel back the onion, the complexity of actually making this work is really hard. So that's part of the expertise, the people that we at Angel Beat are trying to bring. All right, let me go to the next slide and I'll be quiet now.
No, that's a terrific point, and that's why I think it's important that when we talk about LA's Green New Deal, that we're not just talking about like what our goals are, because to be frank, those are easy to set, but what we're actually doing, where we are, how we're accomplishing it, and we have to put together these annual reports documenting how well we're doing and actually achieving them. And sometimes it can be a little humbling. And I'll get into that more on one of our 5 zeros where we've had some setbacks. But it's true, you can set these big goals, but then they need the experts to actually sit down and say, okay, how are we gonna achieve this? So one of the areas that is, many people are surprised to hear that actually for Los Angeles, buildings are our largest source of climate pollution. So buildings are really such an important part to achieving those carbon neutrality goals. But unlike our energy grid, transforming the buildings presents its own particular challenges since they're largely privately owned and decentralized. So to achieve our goal of making buildings net zero carbon by 2050 and dramatically reducing energy use, we've really taken a twofold approach of energy conservation as well as electrification. So in 2016, the mayor signed one of the most ambitious and comprehensive water and energy efficiency laws for existing buildings. And efforts such as these have saved customers $1.8 billion. And we've seen a 35% reduction in carbon emissions from buildings during the mayor's term. We're greening our buildings by being the first city to adopt the Buy Clean California Act using low carbon materials in our municipal buildings and infrastructure, while also committing to electrifying those all new municipal buildings. So because of efforts like these and the commitment of building owners, that LA was recently named the #1 Energy Star city in the country. This is actually for the 10th time in a row. So meaning we have the most green buildings anywhere in the country. Next slide. As we were chatting about at the beginning, Ron, LA is known as the car capital of the nation. But with the investments that we've made in our transportation system, we've really transformed our city into an electric car capital of the world. So this has been done through a variety of measures to help move the market. For instance, in 2018, Mayor Garcetti and 21 other US cities and counties leveraged their collective buying power and made a commitment to purchase over 350 EVs, which really sent a strong signal at that time to the car industry that the EV transformation was happening. It was happening nationwide. So this collaborative has grown to over 250 cities, counties, universities, transit agencies, port authorities, and they're committed to purchasing 4,000 EVs. And Los Angeles actually has the second largest municipal EV fleet after New York City. So turning to our port, which I feel like we've heard a lot in the news, especially with COVID and some of the issues there, it's really our Port of Los Angeles is actually the busiest container port in the Western Hemisphere. And it's also a significant source of air pollution. So we established a clean truck fund to accelerate EV heavy duty truck deployment. And we received a $25 million investment from Electrify America to invest in zero emission vehicle infrastructure at the Port of LA as well as the Port of Long Beach. We're collaborating with other ports, across the Pacific. In January, the Port of LA, Port of Shanghai, and C40 cities announced a first of its kind partnership to create the world's first trans-Pacific green shipping corridor between the ports in the United States and China. Next slide.
Hey, Victoria, Cameron had a question if the city of LA is investing in any V2G technologies for their fleet. And I'm not familiar with V2G is, but maybe you could.
Grid. Yes, I'm so glad that you asked that. Because we are actually doing LADWP, the Department of Water and Power, is piloting some programs there to really demonstrate the potential of V2G. That there's a lot of hope, I think, in terms of what's possible. So we've got a few vehicles set up ready to do that pilot. I believe Leaf vehicles are the only ones that, at least in LA, maybe it's elsewhere as well, that can operate with that functionality, but it's on our grid. But yes, we are doing some work in that area. So this is the one where I was talking about how, doing those annual reports, it kind of can be a humbling experience because you see, okay, zero waste. That is a very, very ambitious goal. And admittedly, we are not at a zero waste city yet, but we're working towards it. And, while waste is actually a much smaller percentage of our greenhouse gas emissions, it is a very large source of the type of emissions released from landfills that are extremely potent. And so it's important that we address this for many reasons, but also including for the carbon emissions they do have. But and also when thinking about our waste stream, it has a lot of potential because it can also provide power through anaerobic digestion, as well as revitalizing our soil with composting. So like I said, it took kind of a hit during the pandemic where the attention and focus wasn't so much on reducing waste, but probably actually increasing it in a lot of ways. But we have absolutely reactivated our efforts from expanding our organic waste collection to implementing zero waste strategies within city government facilities. And in fact, recently we've doubled the amount of residential composting that we're doing from 20,000 to 40,000 homes, along with additional drop-off locations at farmers markets across the city. And we planned by January that all households will have composting availability. And I'm not sure if the person here from the county is going to touch on it at all, but they are also doing some really terrific work when it comes to reducing single-use plastics. Next slide.
One other thing I know from Victoria's talk at previous programs, she's very open and willing. So if you're interested in more information about what the city of LA is doing, obviously very impressive. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. She could share with you her best practices, what the mayor and Victoria's team are doing in other parts of the country, if you're a municipality, or quite honestly, if you're a large corporation, you've got a big corporate campus, you've got lots of waste, you're concerned about energy. The city of LA, and for that matter, the county as well, representing just huge organizations. You'll probably hear about this in a similar way from Microsoft at the end of the program, have so much insights and best practices, they'll be willing to share it with you. You can just contact me, Ron Gerber at Angel Beat at the end with all of your comments, and I can follow them through so you can understand their best practices.
Yeah, I think that's a great point because obviously climate change and pollution and emissions, it really has no borders. So of course, the work we're doing is to improve the lives of residents, but it's also to be a model for what can happen, elsewhere, and alongside us taking those same like best practices from other cities. And I'll get into that in the slide after this about what we're doing in that area. So, many of you have either read about or directly experiencing some of the most dramatic impacts of climate change, which we've really seen in the Western United States when it comes to these historic mega droughts that are occurring. And recognizing the severity of that crisis, Mayor Garcetti has set about since the beginning of his administration to really transforming LA's water system. We are working towards becoming much more self-reliant and through the development of innovative technologies to recycle our wastewater, and also investing in stormwater capture systems across the city. So he championed the Save the Drop campaign, which encourages people to significantly reduce their water consumption. And when we had a drought towards the beginning of his administration and implemented the Save the Drought campaign, it really became a way of life for a lot of people. So now that we're experiencing another, terrible drought, people have been so activated. I mean, month after month, we're seeing historic lows in terms of our water consumption because of how people are responding. But we're not just stopping at telling people don't so heavily water your lawn. We're also investing in something called Operation Next, where we're transforming our Hyperion wastewater treatment plant into one of the largest water recycling plants in the entire world. Next slide. So as I was mentioning about the importance of collaboration and taking best practices and kind of creating a competitive spirit of like who's going to outdo the other one in sustainability work. We are, Mayor Garcetti was the chair of C40 Cities, which is a network of the world's largest cities committed to addressing climate change in an equitable manner. And it's really an important platform to innovate, support, and collectively lead on local climate action on a global scale. And the city is very involved in that. In the run up to the UN Conference of Parties, COP26, it was important to show the critical role that cities play in addressing climate change. So the mayor led the city's Race to Zero campaign. It was an effort to get 1,000 cities, large and small, to commit to reaching net zero emissions by 2050 and cut their fair share of global emissions by 2030. So in November, when COP26 took place, Mayor Garcetti was able to announce before the United Nations that 1,049 cities had actually signed on. This marked the biggest commitment outside of national commitments at COP26, and it would have the impact of eliminating somewhere between the fourth and fifth largest emitters of greenhouse gas emissions in the world. Next slide. So Ron asked me to touch a little bit on this really important law that was recently passed. So, there's so much that can happen through the Inflation Reduction Act in terms of accelerating some of the work that we're doing. And I think we received a huge bump when this was signed this past August. So it's a $700 billion law with $369 billion just on climate and clean energy investments. This marks a really historic investment for the United States in addressing the climate crisis. It's estimated that it will reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030, which doesn't get us to the Paris Climate Agreement, but it certainly puts us on a path towards it. It's also expected to save families approximately $1,800 a year in gas and utility costs, as well as 3,900 lives per year by 2030. just due to pollution reductions. The bill really stays away from like heavy regulation to achieve this, but instead it's more focused on driving investments in the most heavily polluted parts of the economy. So the transportation sector and the electricity generation. Another standout element of the bill is the 60 billion in investments towards climate and environmental justice programs. Well, so many of the new programs really are targeting disadvantaged communities. It's also the first time that we've seen the Biden administration apply the Justice 40 executive directive explicitly in the bill. Next slide. So there is a lot of detail, a lot of still unanswered questions about how all of this will sort out, but I kind of bucketed some of the different programs into these five different areas. So a lot of it does build off of the bipartisan infrastructure bill, but unlike that bill, the IRA doesn't rely on formula funding where states are given like a set amount of money to distribute. Instead, many of the programs are open to cities to compete alongside states or come in the form of tax credits to businesses, industry, homeowners, and individuals. So there's 5 basic buckets. The first really focused on reducing greenhouse gases and improving air quality. So some important elements of that is like 5 billion to develop greenhouse gas reduction plans. And states and cities or tribes can apply for that. There's 27 billion for a greenhouse gas reduction fund to support the rapid deployment of low and zero emission technologies. And 40% of that is directed towards low income and disadvantaged communities. There's also 3 billion for environmental and climate justice block grants for community-led programs in disadvantaged communities. So kind of going to that point I made earlier about the Justice 40 element of it. The second bucket looks at improving the building stock. So that's done through energy efficiency and clean energy. There's a bill, 1 billion to update the latest building energy codes and zero energy. There's 4.3 billion for home energy performance based rebates and 4.3 for high efficiency electric home rebate programs, which is, I think going to be pretty huge. Even in looking at my own home, it was pretty expensive to go fully electric, especially if it's an existing home. So I think some of these funding opportunities are really going to be helpful. The third bucket is more focused on natural resources, agriculture, and community resilience. There's 5 billion to support fire resilient forests, forest conservation, urban tree planting, 2.6 in grants billion in grants to conserve and restore coastal habitats, and 4 billion for drought mitigation. The fourth bucket, one of the big ones, is on the transportation sector. There's 400 million on heavy duty vehicles with zero emission, heavy duty vehicles for zero emissions, 60 million for grants and rebates to reduce diesel emissions from goods movement facilities like the Port of Los Angeles. There's 3 billion in loans for new clean vehicle manufacturing, which is very important because of some of the restrictions around the individual tax credits for electric vehicles. And to that point, the last bucket that I'll speak to are on the tax credits. So municipal utilities like LADWP are now eligible for the clean energy production tax credit, which amounts to $62 billion and $65 billion for the clean electricity tax investment program. And we see 7.54 billion for individuals to purchase new and used zero emission vehicles. And this would equate to like 4,000 in tax credits for low and middle income individuals for used vehicles, and 7,500 for tax credits to buy clean new vehicles. So this kind of skims the top of what's in the IRA, but as you heard, there is a lot there, and it's going to really help us to push harder and faster in transitioning our economy towards a carbon neutral and more equitable future. All right, that's what I have. So if there's any questions, feel free to put it in the chat or speak up.